Things are going to get interesting today. We're going to be talking about imaginary numbers. Weird, right? Trust me, this is kind of cool. All right, let's take a look. Little refresher here, little reminder. If you have a positive number and you multiply it to a positive number, it gives you a positive. Yes? Okay. If you have a negative number times a negative number, it also gives you a positive. Which in essence, if you multiply a number by itself, it's always going to be positive. Correct? Okay. So if I ask you, what is the square root of 4? That's asking what times itself is 4. And we're going to say 2. 2 times 2 is 4. All right? What about the square root of 9? What times itself equals 9? Well, that's 3. Pretty straightforward. So what happens if I say what is the square root of negative 4? What times itself is going to be a negative? Well, if it's a positive number, timesing it by itself is going to give you a positive. If it's a negative number, timesing it by itself is going to give you a positive. There's no possible way to multiply a number by itself and get a negative. And that's where imaginary numbers come into play. Just like we've done before, if I went to simplify this, well, the square root of negative 4, I'm going to split that into negative 1 and the square root of 4. Because I know the square root of 4 is 2. But what do I do with the square root of that negative 1? That is the definition of an imaginary number. The square root of negative 1 equals I. So that's a lowercase I. Sorry, we got a glare there. It's just an I. Little cursive I. That is the definition for our imaginary numbers. So when I take the square root of this negative 1, it's going to give me I. So I have 2 times I is the square root of negative 4. Simple as that. Anytime you take the square root of a negative number, it's going to give you an imaginary solution. So, if we had the square root of negative 100, I can still split this to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 100. Square root of 100 is 10. The square root of negative 1 is I. So our answer is 10I. Nice. Okay, that's really all there is to it. Even if our square roots are irrational, meaning they're not integers because it's not a perfect square. So if I want to take the square root of negative 27, well, I'm still going to split this to the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 27. So my square root of negative 1 is going to give me my I. It's imaginary. Thought my phone was ringing, sorry. And now I'm going to factor 27. That's going to give me 3 and 9, and I square root both. Square root of 9 is 3. So I'm left with 3 times I times the square root of 3. So we're still going to be able to simplify our radicals like we did before, but because of this negative, it just becomes imaginary. Okay, tune back in. We're going to look at operations with imaginary numbers.